about women in suffrage and invite other people to join us. I will I'll be sure that we publicize that in our e-blasts. Suzanne, you have anything to say?
I got my website up yesterday and it's actually on there.
Oh, good. Very good.
And you know what? I picked up the bulletin today. I didn't look at it though. Is it in the bulletin?
I think so. Hi, Jim and Mary, hi.
Hey, Jim and Mary.
Hello.
Hello, hello.
Oh, there's the Jim and Mary.
Yeah. Well, you know Jim and Mary. Well, there's Barb.
Hi, Barb.
Hi, how are you? John's here too, but he's on another chair and we aren't together as far as looking at each other.
I was going to say that
together.
was bad news.
We are together though.
Oh, good.
Clarified that.
Glad you worked that out.
But he always enjoys Voices of Women, so wanted to be here.
Good, good.
Okay, we could start a rumor. Did you hear about Barbara and John English?
Let's start that, Kathleen. Hello, Ellie.
Hi, Ellie.
Hi. I'm better late than never.
Here, I think you're coming in just to let you know that he's here.
What kind of rumor?
Oh, that's good.
Mr. England. John.
Mr. Kathleen, would you mind just letting me
Everybody or just
say
the person?
hello? Because we haven't seen each other in so long.
It's great to see people.
Well, okay.
Yeah.
No, you have a choice. I'm just saying if that's what you prefer. That's fine. You go like the other way.
Mary, how are you doing?
Mary and Jim Hardy.
I'm doing okay. You know, I'm hanging in there. I started a new treatment about a month ago, and it seems so far to be working. So that's good.
That's good news.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Good news.
Yeah.
Well,
Good
you're on
news.
my regular prayer list. Oh,
Well, I appreciate that. I feel like that makes a huge difference.
Look at Jim has cloned himself.
I've cloned myself, yes. I'm gonna go make lunch.
Okay.
I don't know why he's doing that. Whatever.
The English turned green. Jim is giving us a house tour. Oh, good.
Uh-oh.
Jim, what's for lunch?
Well, it all depends.
I'm a little
Okay.
hungry here now all of a sudden. I'm missing the Voices of Women's snacks.
Yeah, I was thinking about that, and I thought, oh, I miss getting all the treats we have after Voices of Women.
I know.
Misses the treats. Yes.
Well, I like where you are, Kathy Little. You've got the best one so far.
I'm in my sunroom.
Yes.
Oh, nice.
very nice.
All right, let's get started. What happened?
Did I see Suzanne?
Mm-hmm.
Suzanne's here someplace.
Okay.
Hi, Ellie.
There she is. Hi, Suzanne.
Hi, Ellie.
Hi, how are you? Listen, I just discovered we have a mutual friend.
Well, we have Nancy Thomas. We knew that.
Okay, wait a minute.
Oh,
It says it's unstable, but.
hi, Linda.
Okay, do you have any questions?
Just
Suzanne?
until the speaker comes on.
Oh, Dottie also. Really?
Yes.
That's great. Oh, yes.
So Deirdre, did you want to begin or?
I was thinking about that. I was going to ask people if they were ready. We're up to 18 participants. So, all right. Well, let's see. I want to welcome everybody. I'm glad that you figured out the Zoom coordinates and that we have everybody on board. And I especially want to welcome our guest, Julie Kruger. Julie is a lifelong Buffalo resident, been practicing law for 10 years. Graduated from Canisius College in Buffalo and the State University of New York at Buffalo Law School. So when we chatted the other day, I was so impressed when I asked her the reason that she was involved in immigration law. She said because her heart told her that she really wanted to help other people have a better life. So it's especially fitting today because today is the World Sunday for migrants and refugees. So I think we chose the speaker and the date very well. So Julie said that prior to attending law school, she had worked in politics and government for a while, and that she heard so many stories that was part of the reason that she went on to law school and specialized in immigration law. So I also have some housekeeping directions, what I nearly forgot. At the bottom of, well, the bottom of my screen, I don't know about yours, there is a way to mute yourself until you need to say something. That way there's not a lot of background noise. Julie has said that she's welcoming questions. So again, somewhere on your screen, at mine it's on the bottom with a little bar of icons. You click on reactions, she could see that you wanted to ask a question and say something. So Kathleen, did I forget anything else? We're muting, until we're ready to talk, and asking questions, you click on the reaction button. So, unless I'm missing something, Kathleen.
Do you want it muted so they can't hear?
We're good.
Right now they can hear everything.
So,
Yeah.
yep.
Yeah.
If you have yet to mute, please mute so that it cuts down on the background noise. And then that reaction button, if you do a thumbs up, like I just put on mine, that will signal to Julie that you want to ask a question or make a comment, and she'll call on you. Then you just have to unmute yourself. It just helps us with the background noise, as Deirdre said.
I just wanted to say before I mute myself, if you want to, you could put yourself out of gallery and put yourself into speaker so that you can really focus in on the speaker and not have such a broad range of people to speak to look at.
Thanks, Susie. That's good.
Okay, so without further ado, we welcome Julie Kruger. Thank you, Julie, for coming. And the floor is all yours, or I should say the screen.
The screen. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. And it was great to meet you, Deirdre, the other day and learn a little bit about your group. So I thank you all for inviting me to talk about immigration. As Deirdre had said, that I'm an immigration lawyer in Buffalo, New York. I own my own firm. It's a small firm. My practice is mostly family immigration, a little bit of business, deportation work, complicated citizenship and appeals cases. And I've been practicing about 10 years. So what I'm going to talk today about is immigration. And as Deirdre had put in the bulletin, or whoever sent that out, immigration is a topic that really gives us the opportunity to ask big questions about who we are as an American society, and who we consider to be one of us, who is not one of us or other, and you know, what rights do we have to draw a circle around ourselves and say, this is us, these are the people who are us, This is our land. These are our resources, our water, our food. And we are either, yes, you can come in and share this land and resources with us, or no, you cannot share this land and these resources with us. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, who Americans have decided we include as one of us, a little bit of the history of immigration, of how we got to where we are today, a little bit about the process of how people immigrate to the United States, and how people become an American citizen, and some of the current issues that we see here in our local Western New York community. And I want to be clear from the beginning that this is not a political discussion. I'm not going to be talking about who you should be voting for, or what you should be, or whatever issues that you should care about when you are voting. This really is a talk to learn about the context and to give you some facts so that you can better understand the stories that you hear, probably on the news or with friends and family, with your church group. And you can understand those stories and you can make informed decisions on your own. I will also say that I have notes, so when I'm looking down, I'm looking at my notes so I stay on track. But you can feel free to interrupt me and ask a question. As someone said, you can either put up like a notification at the bottom and I can stop talking, or you can feel free to just unmute yourself and interrupt me. I am not wearing my glasses, so when you put your thumbs up so that the glasses don't have the glare in the video, I probably won't be able to read your name. I've got my notes printed out in a gigantic font. So anyway, just you can feel free to unmute yourself or raise your hand, and I'll just say, okay, the person who raised their hand, please interrupt. So who are we? So American society is made up of about 330 million people. Today, about 40 million people living in the US were originally born in another country. The population of immigrants who come to the United States is very, very diverse. Just about every country in the world is represented in the people who are living in the United States today. So when I think of who is us, who is America, I think of US citizens. And so citizens is about 93% of the population of the United States. So the vast, vast majority of the people living in the United States are United States citizens, whether depending on how they became US citizens. There's 3 ways in general that somebody can become a United States citizen. So one is birth on the soil, and one is by blood, and one is through naturalization. So birth on the soil means, just like it sounds, you're actually born on the US soil land. And this birth on the soil tends to be a more inclusive philosophy. So countries that want to have more people be one of us, have anybody who's born here is a US citizen or is a citizen of that country. Birth by blood is a more exclusive philosophy, where even if you're born here, that doesn't necessarily make you one of us. You have to be one of us by blood. And by blood means that you could then be born somewhere else in another country, not on US land, but that still makes you a US citizen because of your ancestry, your parents, one parent or both parents were US citizens. And then naturalization is becoming a citizen by choice. Someone who has come here, lived here for a certain amount of time, and chooses to become one of us. And we choose, yes, we want you to become one of us. Immigrants in the United States is about 25 million people total, people who are not currently in the United States. Currently citizens. And most of those people are in the United States legally. The majority of immigrants who are in the United States are legally here. Naturalized citizens are about 45% of the immigrants that are here. Green card holders, who are technically called lawful permanent residents, are about 27% of immigrants. People who have various non-immigrant types of visas, like work visas or other kind of temporary statuses, visitors, that's about 5% of immigrants. And then about 23% of the immigrants, of the people who are here, have no lawful immigration status. Obviously these numbers can change and are fluid, but about 10.5 million people is in general what they estimate to be of the number of people who are here without any lawful immigration status right now. And so talking about those various groups, I want to pause and just mention something that I think is really important when you are listening to people talk about immigration, to your, politicians, to leaders, to news media, to friends, to family members. I just would recommend that you listen really carefully to the words that people choose to say and to refer to immigrants by. And I think that those words tell us a lot about what that person thinks about immigrants and people from other countries. So some people, and especially when you're talking about about immigrants who don't have lawful status in the United States, we hear words like non-citizens, we hear undocumented immigrants, we hear illegals, we hear aliens, foreigners, migrants, refugees. So there's a lot of different words. So just pay attention to that, and how their language colors their views as to policy and all the other sorts of things that go along with immigration. I just think that's an interesting thing and a thing to start noticing when you're hearing people talk about immigration. And so why does this topic matter? What does it matter with, I should have muted the phone. Sorry if there's gonna be a phone in the background. Usually people don't call Sunday at noon. Why does it matter? Why do we care about who is a citizen and what does it mean for people? And being a citizen in the US comes with really, really important rights and benefits and responsibilities. And is really meaningful for people. Being a citizen means you have the ability to vote, to decide who our leaders should be and what our laws should be. Being a citizen means that you can carry a US passport, which traditionally was always one of the most powerful passports in the world. Today, under this global pandemic, we've got one of the first times we're seeing limited ability for US citizens to travel, but typically US passports are a really powerful passport. As a US citizen, you can't be denied entry to the United States. So if you leave the US, we can't say, no, you can't come back in. And you can't be deported from the United States. Once you're one of us, we're stuck with you. You can run for public office. You have the ability to sponsor your foreign relatives to come to the United States. You have the ability to get in certain jobs. And so there's really a lot of important benefits and rights that come with U.S. citizenship. So it is a really, really important thing for someone to have. And as we talk about, these rights and about who can become a citizen, I want you to remember that before the 20th century, we're going to talk about this a little more, but that there really was very little reason for women to become citizens because they weren't eligible for most of these benefits. They weren't eligible for voting or running for public office or the ability to have certain jobs. So what point was for them to become US citizens? So who can become a US citizen in the US? Traditionally, when people first began arriving into the US from Europe, there were no citizenship laws or immigration laws. People just showed up. So it wasn't really actually until 1790 that the US had its first law about who could become a United States citizen, then with the Naturalization Act of 1790. And this law was passed by the same men who were at the Constitutional Convention and who were in the first Congress. So it's really thought to be the best indication about what the founding fathers thought about who is one of us, who should be a part of our country. So the Naturalization Act, it's fascinating because these requirements are actually really similar to what the requirements are still today. So this initial law really, some of the details are different, but the main laws the main concepts are still there. So it required 2 years residency in the United States. Today it's 5, but still same law. Lived in the state for 1 year. Today it's 3 months, but still, again, same criteria. It required good moral character. that requirement is still there in our law today. You still have to show good moral character. And it required that you be a free white person. So that's obviously a notable difference in our laws today, that doesn't exist anymore. But that free white person was is obviously an exclusionary and limited a lot of people from becoming United States citizens for quite a long time. So you'll notice that free white person obviously did not include Native Americans. Native Americans could not become US citizens. It included slaves, or excluded, I mean, it excluded slaves, indentured servants, and free blacks. And it also excluded Asians. But the word again is person. It was free white persons, so that did not exclude women. But again, a lot of those, there wasn't a lot of reason for women to become citizens. So it wasn't actually until then, decades and decades later, 1855, that the kind of the next citizenship laws, mid 1800s, the next laws get passed about citizenship and restricting who could come into the United States and who could, the more immigration laws kind of began. So 1855, the Congress just deemed all foreign-born women who were married to U.S. citizen husbands, they're just all deemed U.S. citizens, whether they wanted to or not, whether they were in the United States or not. If you were married to a United States citizen, you were a U.S. citizen. And until 1922, most courts wouldn't even naturalize, even if they could naturalize, would not naturalize women who were not married to United States citizens. So it really was focused on your marriage and your connection to a husband. And women were found to have lost their United States citizenship if they married a foreigner. And so this had some, strange results. So even if you remained in the United States, but you married someone who was ineligible for citizenships, for example, a Chinese man, you lost your U.S. citizenship. And if during World War II, you married a German citizen, it meant that you had to World War I, World War I, that was, you were required to register as an enemy alien because you were a woman who was married to a German citizen. And it wasn't until 1922 that the Married Women's Act gave women the right to naturalize on their own, completely untied to their husbands. And then, so citizenship laws kind of evolved, from that, 1850s up until now. 1898 granted citizenship to everyone born on the soil. And so that's when that concept began. 1924, Native Americans were all granted United States citizenship. And then in the 1950s is when they removed the racial barriers to citizenship. And then in the 1990s, the immigration laws became administrative laws rather than you weren't naturalized by a judge, which is how it had been before. Instead, you were naturalized through an agency. The time it was INS, now it's USCIS. And the laws to become a citizen are really similar that they were back then. As I said, you had to be a certain amount of residence, certain amount of physical presence here, good moral character. Today, you also have to show a basic understanding of our government, and you have to show that you can speak English at a pretty basic level. And you have to show that you're attached to the principles of the U.S. Constitution. So the next thing I want to talk about is the sort of restrictionist immigration laws, or why don't people ask a lot, why don't people just come here legally? Why are there these people who don't have a lawful immigration status in the U.S.? Shouldn't they just follow the laws and get here legally? Well, those laws are difficult to comply with if you don't have already a connection to the United States. The initial laws that started in those 1850s and late 1800s in the United States were really focused on protecting white America. So all the early immigration laws were to limit the ability of certain types of people from coming into the United States. And a lot of those early concepts, although maybe the racial barriers aren't there anymore, but those concepts are really still in our laws today. And we still see, if you now that you're going to hear these, when you hear the conversations that are happening around immigration today, you'll see that the same language, the same concepts are all still there in that conversation. So the first laws were focused on barring women and barring Asians from coming into the United States. And a lot of them were focused on women, especially because, you know, women represented roots, women represented starting a family, having children, and generations to come of people staying in the United States. So, the laws were really focused on preventing foreigners from being able to come in and establish roots here in the U.S. So one of the first immigration laws, 1875, the Page Act, the word that they chose was they wanted to bar undesirables. And undesirables was defined as a person from East Asia who was coming to the United States as a forced laborer, was any East Asian woman coming to engage in prostitution, and all people who were considered to be convicts in their own country. The only part of this first law that was enforced was the part barring women coming into the US, and specifically Chinese women. This was really targeted at Chinese women. This was not because, you know, the people making this law were altruistic and really worried about the experiences of those women and girls who were coming in and not wanting them to be, you know, sold or tricked into prostitution. This was really about protection of white America. They believed, you know, they wanted to protect the fate of white men, you know, the white families and a nation constructed as white. Some of the quotes in the language around the passage of this law in this time period, to me, comes across as really shocking. So President Grant at the time said, I invite the attention of Congress to another, though perhaps no less an evil, the importation of Chinese women, but few of whom are brought to our shores to pursue honorable or useful occupations. Another one was Chinese women cause disease and immorality among white men. And even, you know, the even respected doctors, the American Medical Association believed that Chinese immigrants, this is a quote, carried distinct germs to which they were immune, but from which whites would die if exposed. So really, really heavily anti-Asian, especially anti-Chinese, and focused on keeping women out. Then the next laws focused on prohibiting the entry of idiots, lunatics, convicts, and persons likely to become a public charge. And then the next ones added polygamists, persons convicted of crimes of moral turpitude, and those suffering loathsome or contagious diseases. All of those things are still in our immigration laws today. If you have mental illness and you are a danger to yourself or others, you are barred from coming into the U.S. A big thing in the news today, and in a lot of my clients' cases, the current administration has really ramped up how they treat people that may become a public charge in the United States, and how they assess people that to decide if someone is going to become a public charge in the United States. This is a big, big issue right now in immigration, this public charge issue. Polygamy is still banned. Persons convicted of crimes involving moral turpitude, that's still banned. And that is, moral turpitude is like an inherently bad act. So something that is bad because it is bad in and of itself, not bad because it's prohibited. So speeding is not a crime involving moral turpitude. That's something that you did wrong only because it was prohibited. Crimes involving moral turpitude could be theft or fraud, things like that. And then obviously more serious crimes as well. And loathsome or contagious diseases. This as well, this has been a ban for a long time and continued in our laws today. This is where we see a lot of laws around the coronavirus today, this health-related ground of barring people from coming into the United States. This initial language is where we see today the ability to block people from coming into the United States because of coronavirus and trying to prevent the spread of that. So these same laws that, you know, started in the mid to late 1800s, we still have those same concepts in immigration today. In the 1950s and 1960s, after World War II, immigration laws were really changed dramatically in the way that they process, and the general framework for how we process cases was established and is basically still here today, focusing really on three main areas of allowing people to come into the United States. One of those is family-based immigration. And that was really focused on the soldiers returning from World War II who had married and had children abroad. They wanted to be able to bring their new families back to the United States. So family immigration was really a big part of that. Family immigration is not something that every country has, and it really can dramatically change the makeup of the people that are allowed to come into the country. So for example, Canadian immigration is focused more on a point system where you show that you have a certain, ability to speak language and job skills and education history, rather than on familial ties. And so that kind of tends to change who comes into the United States or comes into Canada. Canadian immigrants tend to more easily sometimes immigrate into Canadian society because they have shown already that they are similar to the rest of Canadian society. They already speak the language. They have the education and experience to get a job, where simply based on family experience or family relationship doesn't necessarily mean that that person coming in speaks the language, has an education background, has an employment background, and immediately is able to establish themselves into the United States, and kind of melt into the society as well. So not saying either one is right or correct or better, whatever, just different and has different results. So family reunification is a big focus in U.S. immigration law. There is, of course, skilled workers and employment-based immigration. And then we also, in the 1950s and 60s, we start to see the first asylum laws and refugee laws in the United States. And here it's really important to note that when they started to accept refugees into the United States, these early laws, and still today, were not necessarily focused on humanitarian policy. That was not the initial purpose of allowing refugees into the United States. It was always used as a political weapon against enemies. So the first refugees that we see coming into the country were from communist countries that were our enemies at the time, the former Soviet Union, Vietnam, Cuban refugees. In the 80s, then we started to see Iranians and Afghans coming in as refugees. And again, this was more tied to our political strategy than any humanitarian efforts. And then those 50s and 60s laws also removed the racial barriers to immigration and made the laws more gender neutral. And then recent trends in immigration, since 9/11, we really see the emphasis turn to border security, to fighting terrorism, and to deporting people who have criminal convictions in the United States, which can often mean even very minor criminal convictions. So today, family sponsorship is limited to only parent, spouse, child, or brother or sister. Really limited availability, especially for those brother and sister categories. It can take years and years. There's a limited number of visas available. So if you apply, you get your place in line. If you're from Mexico, it might be 20, 25 years before your brother or sister could actually come to the United States with a visa legally. Work visas are very, very limited, and there are huge backlogs for those as well, especially from certain countries, again, Mexico, India, China, Central America. Those nations are very backlogged and limited number of visas available. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the current issues and trends that we see here in our community, that I've seen in my practice as well. So one of the things that I think is really interesting about living in a border community are some of the immigration twists that we see here. So we're, Rochester, Western New York, Buffalo, right here next to Canada, which means that there's, of course, a lot of cross-border travel, families living on both sides of the border. A large a majority of my cases are Canadian and American. One spouse is Canadian, one spouse is American, and the American is sponsoring the Canadian to move to the United States. But that also leads to some really interesting citizenship cases of people who were born across the border either way, and then are trying to prove that they're a citizen in the other country. So I wanted to tell you about a case of a woman that I had that in the 1950s, when her mother was pregnant with her, her mother's parents lived in Canada just across the border. It was a holiday time. And so her mom, although very pregnant, just went over for the day to Canada to visit her parents for a holiday. And of course, while she was there, surprise, went into labor, had the baby, ended up having the baby at home because it was such a quick, delivery, and went to the hospital. And then, was in the hospital a couple weeks and then came home. And when they crossed the border, they said at the booth, we're bringing our new baby back home. And everybody said, congratulations, that's great. And it was no big deal. And so, she was brought home as a, newborn, and not born in the United States though. So that not citizenship by birth on the soil. And then nobody ever thought to take care of any paperwork for her. So now she's, in her 60s and looking to retire, looking to get Social Security benefits, and get Medicare, all the kinds of things that are benefits for just U.S. citizens. And she had also recently married a new husband and wanted to go on a honeymoon trip with him, and went to apply for a U.S. passport and got denied. Because they said there's no proof that you are actually a United States citizen. And so, because you weren't born here. And her mom, one of the things about citizenship laws then and now, is that if you are born abroad, you often have to show that your parent had lived in the United States a certain amount of time before they came to the US. So her mom, at the time that she was born, had just turned 19. And she needed to be able to show that her mom had lived in the US 10 years before she was born. And 5 of those years had to be after she was 14. So if she had to be in the US 5 years after she was 14, and she's only just after 19, there was a very limited time period for her to show that she had 5 years. And because her parents had lived in Canada, my client's mother traveled all the time back and forth across the border. And so my client was not able to show that her mom actually had been in the United States for 5 years between the ages of 14 and 19 when she was born. So, this really created a lot of problems for her. She had been in the US her entire life. She had, put on every single form she'd ever filled out that she was a US citizen. She had always believed she was a US citizen. But was not able to show that. So, she came to us, and we did everything we could to come up with the proof that her mom had actually spent, 5 years between 14 and 19, but with records that old, it just was not possible. So, because she was married to a U.S. citizen, we were able to have her U.S. citizen husband sponsor her for a green card, even though she had lived her entire life in the United States, always thought herself was a U.S. citizen. Both of her parents were U.S. citizens. No reason that she wasn't a U.S. citizen, really. We just couldn't prove it with pieces of paper. So we had to have her get a green card, and eventually she'll be able to then apply for U.S. citizenship and become a U.S. citizen on paper finally. So that's, I get about maybe a couple of cases a year, maybe like 2-3 cases a year of interesting cross-border issues like that that we see here in the local community that I don't think that other communities necessarily might see in their area. Because just of our proximity to Canada and the almost like shared community that we have with Southern Ontario. Another issue that we see today in immigration, as it's affected every other part of our life, of course, is how the coronavirus global pandemic has changed the ability to either come in or leave the country, to leave the United States. This has really, really had a huge impact on immigration. Just generally being, with the border shutdowns and being separated from family members has been so hard on a lot of families. The U.S. embassies and consulates closed around the world in March. And they closed in the sense of not just like shutting down or not being open to the public, but they actually returned the U.S. citizen staff back to the United States. So they really shut down those embassies and consulates around the world, which meant that anybody who was going through a visa process, say their husband or wife had sponsored them to come to the United States, their case is just put on hold, which has been just devastating for thousands of families who are unable to have their spouse's visa processed and come into the United States. We're just starting to see embassies and consulates around the world reopen now. And they first opened for U.S. citizen services, for U.S. citizens who are outside the country needed help. And I just had my first family case rescheduled at the end of August. That was in China. And then one in Montreal this month. So really, really, really slowed down visa processing. Families have been stuck also in the United States together or unintentionally. So people who had come into the U.S. maybe in March and then the border shut down and hadn't planned necessarily to stay in the United States, but all of a sudden found themselves here with the border shut down and realizing that if they left the U.S., they didn't know when they might be able to come back, even if they just live in Fort Erie and see their spouse again or see their, fiance or boyfriend or girlfriend or whatever. And so families are having to make, decisions about what are we going to do now and how are we going to deal with this immigration situation where I just came as a visitor. I have a client who literally, came for the weekend with a weekend bag of clothes. And, then the border shut down and, they had to scramble and make different decisions and figure out how are they going to deal with this situation? How are they going to deal with it for employment purposes? And just, it's been a really crazy situation for a lot of immigrant families. We've also seen those health-related bans that I mentioned earlier. So, citizens from China, citizens from the UK, a bunch of the countries in Europe. If you have been in one of those countries in the last 14 days, you cannot enter the United States. There are exceptions to that, such as U.S. citizens and green card holders, but generally. And that has made also families separations really difficult, and just travel, business travel as well, really complicated. So if you want to be able to, if you're in the UK and you want to be able to come to the United States, you have to leave the UK and be in a country that is not part of the CDC's ban for 14 days, and then you would be allowed to come into the United States. So that one is a health-related ban and where you've been rather than which country you're a citizen of. There are also currently a lot of travel bans based on which country you're a citizen of. And those, have started before the coronavirus. The Trump administration, right at the beginning, when Trump was first in office, began imposing travel bans on citizens of certain countries, Yemen, Sudan, Iran, Syria, a bunch of countries. I think it's ended up 14 in total, Venezuela, Chad, other countries. And just banning, just by virtue of being a citizen of that country, you're banned from coming into the US for certain purposes. So each country's, the rules are a little bit different. There are exceptions to all of the rules, but that has really created crises for especially families that are separated. I have it here in the Buffalo area, and I believe in Rochester as well, but there's a large Middle Eastern population. I have a lot of clients who are originally from Yemen. And when they are trying to sponsor family, especially wives and children, to come over to the United States, they're subject to these travel bans. It has delayed cases for years. And really separated families caused a lot of hardships for families who are separated, even though there are exceptions for example, spouses and children to some of the travel bans. They'll just put the case into administrative processing and it'll just delay the case for years. So it's really, really been, those bans have had a dramatic effect on visas. And then since the coronavirus, there have been a whole host of new bans on coming into the United States, certain types of non-immigrant work visas like H-1Bs and Ls. No more issuance of those. immigrant visas have been limited to spouses and children only, so no employment-based immigrant visas, no brothers and sisters, no parents. And then, the other thing that we've really seen in our community related to the coronavirus pandemic, of course, with the detention facility at the Buffalo Federal Detention Facility in Batavia, New York, detainees there have been exposed to the coronavirus. It really raises important questions about the consequences, and we've seen the same kind of questions for criminal incarceration as well. But the consequences of being detained for an immigration violation, and should one of those consequences be being exposed to a potentially life-threatening illness, is that worth being detained for? Should people be released because of this pandemic? It raises a lot of questions there, and we have also seen people being deported from the United States back to their home countries upon arrival at their home countries being tested positive for coronavirus. So that's been something that's really been dramatic and furthering the spread of the virus to other countries that we've seen happen. So another area that we see locally with immigration cases is in asylum cases. So, and again, as I mentioned, when you're hearing about asylum seekers in the United States, keep in mind that history of asylum is using asylum as a political weapon against enemies and not for humanitarian reasons. And so that kind of often illuminates, why certain cases that you might hear on the news that's seemingly very sympathetic, and those people are not being approved for visas. That kind of, if you have that in the back of your mind, then you kind of realize why those cases aren't being approved. So the highest approval rates for asylum for 2019 were for Chinese nationals. And so you think about, our situation today in the world and who we might think of as, we want to use political weapons against, that suddenly makes complete sense, right? And the current administration also has decided that fleeing domestic violence and gang-related violence are not grounds for asylum. And so a lot of the times when we hear Central American claims, we hear claims for asylum, we hear cases where someone is fleeing domestic violence or is fleeing gang-related violence. Those are not going to be considered grounds for asylum in the United States. And here in Western New York, asylum seekers are from all parts of the world, but probably at least about half of them are from Central America. Mexico, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras are the main countries from Central America that we see here in Western New York. Denial rates for asylum are very, very high. They are about 80% of asylum cases are denied at the Buffalo Federal Detention Facility in Batavia, New York. And then there's an immigration court here in Buffalo as well. And that is probably about maybe like 65 to 75% denial rate. So very slim chances of getting asylum in the United States, in the Western New York area. And this is not the situation across the country as well. So in New York City, for example, if you're applying for asylum and you live in New York City and you're going to the New York City rate, some of the judges there have 80% approval rates. So that also sort of raises the question of why would your case be so much more successful depending on which judge or where you're applying for? Shouldn't the laws be the same everywhere? Those Central American cases that I mentioned, especially the ones that we see here in Western New York, do tend to be people fleeing violence. I'll tell you an example of a story that in one of my cases, I had a young woman who was a nurse in her home country in Central America. And she worked for a small clinic, and gang members in her community were not targeting her necessarily, but her boss, the owner of the clinic, who was wealthy. And they wanted, the gang members approached my client and told her you need to give us details on the movement of your boss. We want to be able to extort her. We want to get money from her. And you need to tell us when she opens the clinic, when she closes the clinic, where she lived, that kind of stuff, so that we can follow her, we can get her, and we can get money from her. And she refused to give the information. So, you know, the threats sort of, they kept coming back and getting more increasingly serious threats, until the point where she was kidnapped by gang members, taken up to the hills, and tortured in various ways. And for example, they took cigarette butts and they burned various places on her body, so that she would be frightened, obviously, and give them the information. They also beat her up pretty bad. Took her back home, and she decided, that's enough. I'm getting out of here. This is too much for me. And she left, and she basically walked from her country up to the US border, came into the US. She was caught right away at the border, placed into a detention facility, and then transferred up here to Buffalo. They often at the southern border will run out of bed space and then transfer people around the country, with no relation to where they might have friends or family members. So she ended up here in the Western New York area, and we did an asylum claim for her. And that asylum claim lost, and in part because of it was a gang-related violence claim. And also because that amount of torture, the things that I described, the burning with the cigarettes, the beatings, and the threats, were not considered to be enough for persecution. But asylum, you have to show that you've been persecuted, and that it was determined that did not rise to the level of persecution. So, you know, and you kind of wonder, like, well, should she have waited to be more persecuted and so that she could get here and be successful? I mean, you know, there's horrible questions like that. We also see cases from West Africa, an increasing number of West African cases here in the Western New York area. And these can be really complicated cases, I think, because, especially because I think each of the country's situation is very different. And there's first a level of education that needs to be done in the case, in presenting a case from somebody from West Africa, education about the country, about the history and the background and the situation there, so that that person's claim can be placed in context and then understood. So I have, you know, a few cases from West African countries now. So there'll be, for example, I have a young woman who, you know, was caught up in a political battle that she had nothing to do with, but forces from one political party came to her area and just, you know, started killing people because they were all believed to be part of the other political party. She took her son, fled the country. Her husband was killed. She and her son just, you know, literally ran to the next country over, with everybody else who was able to escape at that time. And then, you know, made her way. And it's this complicated route that people take to get here, West Africa. You know, they come across often then to South America and then work their way from South America up through Mexico to America, and that journey can take years. And so those can be really difficult cases because you're trying to explain the history of what happened in that country, why their story makes sense. Oftentimes people don't have documentation to prove their story at that time, you know, because they fled their home, you know, during a battle. They didn't stop to, you know, take pictures or, you know, grab any documents or anything. So people often have literally no proof, and it's just their story. And then also explaining why, well, weren't you okay when you stopped in that other country? And what about Brazil? You were there for 3 months. Couldn't you stay there? Couldn't you stay in Ecuador? Couldn't you stay in Guatemala? Couldn't you stay in Mexico? You have to prove why they couldn't stay the whole time. So those cases can be really, really complicated. And then we also see here in the Western New York area that cases are being heard here that are actually cases from the southern border. So this is kind of a new thing that's been taking place over the last year or two. You might hear about it in the news. It's the Migrant Protection Protocols. And so that kind of story that I just described of like people coming through countries to get to the United States, when they're doing that, and they finally get to the US, if they show up at the point of entry and they say, I want to come into the United States and I want to apply for asylum, our law has always been that, then you can make an asylum claim, come into the United States and make an asylum claim. Now they're saying, okay, you can do that, but you have to wait in Mexico. And so courts in Western New York by video are hearing those cases where people are actually living in refugee camps in Mexico, trying to come into the United States and apply for asylum. So we're seeing a lot of those cases here. So those are some of the common issues we see here. We also see, I do a lot of naturalization cases, so I see a lot of cases like that, especially with some of the Yemeni community that I mentioned. Often there's a lot of travel back to the home country, not having enough physical presence in the US, and having a lot of trouble there. I think those are the main issues that we see here in the local community. So I think those are the main things that I wanted to talk about. So as you can see, there are a lot of immigration issues that come up and that, have a grounding from, century or more ago in our laws and our concepts and why we're applying these laws, and we're still dealing with them today, still trying to decide who is us. Why are we letting certain people in? Who don't we want to be one of us, and what those criteria should be? Yeah, so I thank you for listening to all of that. It was a long time of me talking. Does anybody have questions or anything that I didn't talk about that you wanted to talk about?
Yeah, Julie, could I ask two totally different questions?
Yes, of course.
Out of curiosity, if I understood you correctly, single women coming into the country in the late 1800s or the early 1900s wouldn't be eligible for citizenship if they were single, not married to an American. Is that right?
They would have been eligible, but in reality, judges wouldn't have naturalized them. They would have found ways to not naturalize them.
So both of my grandmothers from Ireland were illegal immigrants, apparently. The other thing is, totally disconnected, but when you speak of the refugee camps in Mexico, can you give us a sense of what it's like for those people waiting to come into the country?
Yeah, so I don't have a lot of those cases myself, because obviously they're probably hiring an attorney that's on the southern border, even though their cases might be processing it at Buffalo, and the attorneys from Homeland Security here in Buffalo are the ones who are actually prosecuting the cases. But I have, of course, heard a variety of media stories and that, and it sounds pretty grim on the southern border, living in those refugee camps. It sounds like the camps have kind of sprung up not in a formal way, and so therefore really are lacking basic sanitation, water facilities, food, that there is a lot of crime in those refugee camps, and that it's not a good situation to be in, and that people also have very little understanding of why what's happening to them is what's happening to them. That, probably when they started the journey, or in some cases when they started the journey, that wasn't the rule. So they came in thinking that they were going to be able to come into the United States, and in some cases maybe be reunited with family members who were here, even if distant family members or friends, and then got here and were told, no, the law has changed and now you're going to stay in Mexico. And they don't have a legal status in Mexico. If you're coming from Honduras or Guatemala or Africa, and you made your way all the way through here, you don't necessarily have a legal status to remain in Mexico. So Mexico doesn't necessarily want these refugees on their border as well. So I think it's really difficult for people who are trying to pursue their cases, and as well, one of the things I didn't talk about, but the asylum approval rates are really dismal if you don't have an attorney. And attorneys aren't magical, obviously, and they're not 100% if you have an attorney. But it's like, if you don't have an attorney, it's like 98% of people are denied asylum. So people who don't have attorneys, it might be 50% if you have an attorney. So again, it's not a guarantee to hire an attorney and I'll get asylum, but your chances are dramatically better. And so if you are stuck in Mexico, but you're trying to find a immigration attorney in the US who can help prosecute your case and present your claim to an immigration judge and present your evidence and present that whole context needed to understand your case, it's really hard to connect with a US immigration attorney, to meet with that person, to get them your evidence, to talk with them, and to present your case. So that's made it really difficult as well.
Thank you.
I have a question. Can you take my question?
Sure.
This has to do with a case locally in Rochester. There was a young girl who was brought with, as a young child with her family from Mexico. Really no connection. I think she was about 3 years of age. And maybe about 2 or 3 years ago, she phoned in a threat to her high school. And she was arrested and detained. And the judges seem to delay on making a decision because they want to send her back to Mexico, where she has no language, no familiarity with family. She has learning disabilities. So can the judge overrule any law that one judge might use to send her back, but another judge could keep her, let her remain here? Are you familiar with that story?
You know, I have heard of that story just a tiny, tiny bit, so I don't know all the details for sure. But a couple of things come to mind. So one, immigration laws, especially once you're in a deportation proceeding and you don't have a lawful status, if you don't have US citizen, very close family ties, it can be the laws are just heavily stacked against the immigrant. So it can be really, really difficult to prevent deportation. So unless, again, and often those ties need to be a parent or spouse or child, a US citizen who can sponsor that person, or who you could apply for something called cancellation of removal, show why it would be a hardship to your spouse or your parent or your child if you're removed. So two things. So one, once someone is detained, if they're detained, for example, at the Buffalo Federal Detention Facility, there are really specific rules about releasing an immigrant from detention. And you need to show that there is a bond available. It's similar to the concept of bail in a criminal jail. You need to show that you're not a danger to the community and that you're not a flight risk. So I can see how in that situation, if that person called in a threat, there would be an immediate concern that this person was a danger to the community, and not a flight risk. A child, and certainly you would think that, a child would have some family ties and would be able to show that they're pretty rooted here, not a flight risk, that basically they're going to show up to their court hearings if they're allowed to be released. They're still going to come back for their court hearings, which the majority of people do. There are certain situations, though, where somebody is just completely ineligible for release for detention. I don't know if this person is detained or not still, but, so if she was taken directly from criminal custody, she would not be eligible for release from detention, and she would have to pursue her entire case from the detention facility, which makes pursuing your case dramatically more difficult. For those same reasons I just talked about, why it's hard to pursue your case from across the border, it's really hard to pursue your case if you are detained. It's hard to communicate with your family. It's hard to communicate with a lawyer. It's hard to get evidence. It's hard to do research. It's just really hard. It's also really demoralizing. I have never once had a client be happy when they are detained, or throughout the facility. I mean, I've toured the Buffalo Federal Detention Facility. From what I hear on the news and other things, I mean, the jail in Batavia is actually a pretty nice facility. There, people have the ability to go outdoors. There are, for people who do not have criminal convictions or minor ones, there's sort of an open area. You can watch TV, you can go to the library, you can go to the gym, and yet even still they have a pretty good level of medical care there. With all of those things, people are miserable. It is a horrible experience. Nobody wants to be detained. So that sounds like that might be a difficult part of the case. But then especially also, I didn't talk about DACA cases and Dreamers. But those are really huge issues in immigration as well. And that's exactly where they come in, is where someone comes into the country, is brought to the country usually by parents at a very young age, has no ties to their home country, doesn't speak the language. There was the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, which was a program that President Obama had put in, where people could apply and they could at least get a work authorization and kind of get themselves on the map. And DACA, I think was always a troubled program because it was not something that was a law that was passed by Congress. This was done by executive order by President Obama. And that meant that as soon as a president who was elected who did not like DACA, it was immediately taken away. And so, now this person, she never applied for DACA before, she can't do it now. If you have not already, unless you already have DACA and you're renewing it, you can no longer apply for DACA anymore, even if you meet all of the requirements. And so that's made it really, really hard, especially for young people who are in the country with no U.S. citizen ties that could sponsor someone. And that sounds like that's the situation that she's in. Anything like that where there's a criminal issue or she called in a threat like that, that's going to make the case more difficult to be sympathetic to a judge as well. So the judge is really kind of stuck with what the laws are. The laws are stacked against the immigrant. The ability to get relief from deportation. Most of the fighting in an immigration court matter is not about whether the person is deportable. ICE is pretty good about figuring out whether someone or not is deportable, and if they're not deportable, they don't put them in deportation proceedings. Sometimes we fight about that, but most of the time you're really fighting about, yes, we agree they're deportable, but are they eligible for any relief from deportation? And unfortunately, without U.S. citizen ties, sometimes it can be really, really difficult to be eligible for any relief for deportation.
Thank you.
I have a couple of questions. If you could clarify, when you were talking about how the laws now for the family ties, I believe you said it was restricted. Was it just to husbands and wives?
So family ties, the law is parents, spouse, children, and brothers and sisters. However, one of the travel bans related to the coronavirus pandemic has limited the issuance of immigrant visas to just spouses and children. So even though parents and siblings are technically allowed, that's been limited right now. That's in place until the end of the year.
The thing I didn't hear was the children, and that was what I wanted to verify. Also, you said that violence, domestic and gang-related violence, is not grounds for asylum. Now, is there a history in prior administrations of that being the case, or is this new to the Trump administration?
So, good question. It's more formalized than it was previously, but showing that a domestic violence or a gang-related asylum claim rose to the level of asylum was extremely difficult before the Trump administration as well. So the Trump administration has sort of formalized something that was present all along.
But have they, is it virtually impossible now as opposed to prior, even though it was difficult to make?
Yeah, I think so.
Okie dokie. And I think I had one other. Oh, did you say work visas are not allowed anymore?
Certain types of work visas, again, with the coronavirus pandemic, they are no longer issuing H-1Bs, Ls, J visas. I think it's mainly those three, and then immigrant visas, where we're coming in with a green card based on employment, employer sponsored, are also not allowed right now. I think those are all in place until the end of the year.
I don't know what all of those stand for. Is it basically limiting farm workers? Or, are we still allowing the higher level, more intellectual people to come in? Is this really having an effect on less fortunate individuals? Okay. And then the other thing with
it's focused on skilled workers, not necessarily farm workers. H-1Bs are specialty occupations. These are the computer programmers, the highly skilled people with bachelor's degrees. L visas are intra-company transferees. So you work for a company that has a branch in the US and they want you have specialized knowledge, or you're a manager or executive. The company wants to transfer you to the US branch, that kind of thing. So these are the higher level
You're
skilled
saying
workers.
they're not allowed right now. Okay.
They're not allowed in because of it's supposed to be tied
virus.
to the unemployment claims, right, in the US. So we want to hire US workers instead, is the idea.
Okay, well, all right. And finally, what is the preponderance of the reasons that we have people coming across the border right now from Mexico? What are the primary reasons that they're giving for wanting to come in? I mean, I assumed it was from dangerous situations where they live. And if that's not possible, then what does anybody, I guess I'm sort of, it's almost like we've got the wall there at the border, whether it's built or not.
Yes, I often hear people describe it as an invisible wall, right? And that, that's what's been essentially built. Agreed. So a lot of the reasons that I think we see, and I suppose each one of these is debatable, but it is gang violence, general violence, and then economic migration as well. And so I think that's a part of the tension in the asylum, is that, people are saying, well, the criminal situation with the gangs should be dealt with in the home country. It's the economic factors that are really pushing people here, and that's not grounds for asylum. And so, but right, I think that's an excellent question of, people who are fleeing violence or whatever from their home country. Why try to come to the U.S. right now? Because you may not be able to get here, or even when you get here, you may, your ability to be successful is so low. And so, in some cases, people might, even just the ability to be here for a few years might be better than not. Yeah.
I hate to do this because we are out of time. I am so grateful for all the information and for the time that you put into this, Julie. And I wonder if there anybody that is desperate to get another question answered, we maybe could contact you if they.
Yes, absolutely. Let me give you my contact information. So it's Krueger Immigration Law. I have a website, KruegerImmigrationLaw.com. My phone number is 716-393-9878. You could email me at julie@KruegerImmigrationLaw.com. Krueger is Kruger. And I'm on Facebook, and I'm on YouTube and Instagram, and you can find me everywhere else too. So yeah. Thank you so much for having me here. I love being here and hearing the questions and talking with all of you.
Well, we are very grateful for all the information and all the help that you've given us to understand the situation. And we remember that these are all our brothers and sisters, and that today is Worldwide Migrant and Refugee Day. So tomorrow, this video will be up on YouTube. So thank you, everybody, for being part of this. See if I've covered.
Thank you
all
for
of it.
organizing this. Thank you, Julie.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I know.
Everyone. Wonderful.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody, for being part of this.
Leave meeting.
All right. We'll see you all next month, if not before. Okay.
Will there be a link in the topic for next month?
The link will always be the same one that you used to get in today, but it will be in the bulletin and in the e-blast. And there'll be updated information about the speaker. I believe next week or next month, it's Nancy Duricki. So we'll have the information in the bulletin and in the e-blast, but the same way you got in today is how you'll get in next month too.
Well, mine was a challenge. I tried to copy that 20-some letter word, what a number's password, and it took me 15 minutes because I clicked on it, but I had to put the password in. And other Zooms, I never put a password in. And so I had to keep trying it over and over and over again until I finally got it. Because the zeros and the O's are a challenge.
Yeah. And we are opening the room at about 11:30. Well, today we opened up earlier just for that reason. I don't know what to tell you, Josephine. That link, the way that we sent the link is the same way that we've sent the links for other things. So I think we're all in this learning curve. So keep on trying.
Well, I ended up going to the bulletin, and then I found, you know, the article, and then I clicked on it, and then I tried to put that password in. But like I said, that was a challenge. There, I don't know if you know, but there are about 20 or 25 different numbers, letters, and so on. So maybe if the next time I'll get the bulletin and I'll click on. I do the rosary. That's
Right.
the only other thing.
It should be just like the rosary. We sent the invitation the same way as the rosary. So
yeah, but I never had a password for the rosary. On this one, I do. They asked me for a password. Wouldn't let me in.
Well, let me check with Katie about that and see, and we'll figure that out.
Sister Kathleen.
Yeah.
Katie did include the ID and the passcode after we had sent out the initial long one. And so that was included in the Friday's e-blast. But from now on, I will include the ID and passcode that is much easier to use.
Good. Thank you.
Good.
Tell me again, the group is, your group is what?
This is called
Voices of Women.
The what of women?
Voices.
Oh, okay. And it's from Blessed Sacrament?
Well, it originated at St. Mary's, but it's for the 3 parishes. It's a Southeast Rochester group.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
You're
Thank
welcome. All righty. Thanks, Josephine. Roz, thank you. We'll keep working on it. It'll get easier.
Okay. Yes, it will.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.